everyone. My name is Dayna Bayne. I'm a journalism major with a visual media emphasis, and today I'll be presenting, my title's not showing, Journalism as the Cure to the Cultural Detachment from Global Compassion and Why It Matters. So for quite some time now, I've wanted to be a photojournalist in a cross-cultural minority place. I've often described it as capturing the third world and bringing it into the first world via the lens of my camera. But I've always asked myself, why would people care? And what I've noticed is that without a cultural trend of engaging in cross-cultural news, and with the lack of news headlines, we don't understand the importance of caring. And while yes, there is a range of geographical spread and importance based on one's location, I personally believe that large events that hurt so many people need to be equally available to everyone, regardless of location. And so if we were to view news such as these with the kingdom mindset, we shrink our idea that the world is only relevant around me, around Almirada, around LA, and that others are important too. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the lack of headlines. Then I'm going to look into the cultural aspect of everything. And then I'm going to tie into how photojournalism bridges these two things together. And lastly, into my calling. So over the course of this semester, we've experienced a tremendous amount of natural disasters and terror attacks. However, sometimes we don't hear about majority of them. The first one is the Las Vegas shooting. I'm going to ask you guys to raise your hands if you guys are familiar with these things. So how many of you heard about the Las Vegas shooting? How many of you heard about the Somalia bombing? So with Las Vegas, the moment I woke up that morning, my dad said, there was a shooting in Las Vegas. I didn't have to get out of bed. All I did was open my eyes, and I knew about it instantly. When it came to the Somalia bombing, I didn't find out about it until 4 days later, when I was intentionally looking for cross-cultural news, and it was in this teeny tiny heading at the bottom of a newspaper page. In Las Vegas, 59 people were killed, and 527 were injured. In Somalia, 358 were killed, while 228 people were injured. What about the fires? How many of you knew about the California fires? How many of you knew about the Portugal and Spain fires? These two fires happened at the exact same time. 42 people died in California, 41 people died in Spain and Portugal. And now what about the drought? How many of you are aware about the California drought? You're worried about your food supplies and your water supplies. What about the drought in Uganda? Did you guys know there are witch doctors that are sacrificing children and adults to appease the spirits to bring them rain? Did you know that in East Africa, 11 million people are facing food insecurities, while 1.6 million of them are on the brink of famine? And this is my point. News around the world that's equal and catastrophic is silent to us in the West. And this brings me to the next point of why should we care and how our culture deals with it. So first I'm going to explain a little bit about myself and where I'm from and how I grew up, which developed in me a compassion and care towards these type of topics. So as most of you know, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and it's a tiny little island in the Caribbean. Trinidad was colonized in 1498 by Christopher Columbus, and it's a large melting pot as many people came to settle there, either by choice or force, due to slave trades and just Europeans coming. So due to that, my ancestry is extremely mixed. So on my father's side, there's English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And then on my mother's side, I'm Chinese, Indian, Scottish, and Guyanese. And I'm not pointing this out to say that I'm super different, but I want to point out that we all have a mixed ancestry. And that is something that I want you to be aware of, because as we take an interest of who we are and where we've come from, we start to look beyond Southern California, and we look into the greater world. However, I didn't grow up in Trinidad. I was born in Venezuela. I spent about 7 years in South America, going between Maracaibo, Venezuela, to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then Caracas, Venezuela. Spanish was the first culture I knew. I spoke Spanish, I went to Spanish schools, and I did everything in Spanish. I played in Spanish. But when I turned 8, the political climate in Venezuela started to heat up with Hugo Chavez, and so the company was taking people out. So then we moved to Stavanger, Norway. Here I attended international school, but the Norwegian culture was very intertwined with the curriculum. And so we had Norwegian classes, we learned Norwegian stories and songs, we learned about the history and folklore. We would even go on 4-day field trips in the wilderness. We learned how to catch our own fish in a fishing net, kill our fish, clean it, wrap it up in foil, and cook it in the fire that we also learned how to build. I was in 4th grade. After 3 years of that, I moved to Houston, Texas, and that was a whole different ballpark. I picked up an American accent, and I went to a small Christian Texas school. I learned about American football, I learned about pep rallies, and I was introduced to mega churches. I was also there for Hurricane Katrina. We were hunkered down in my parents' bathroom for a couple nights. We didn't have electricity for the week. And after we left Houston, we then went to Trinidad. And even though I spent all my summers and Christmases there, this was the first time I got to live there and grow my own roots in a culture that I call home. And I finally got to learn about it myself. But this culture, crime is rampant. Kidnappings and murders, thefts and harassment is just part of your everyday life. After we left Trinidad, we went back up to England. And I lived there for 4 years. And at first, I really hated it. And then I loved it. I fell in love with the culture, I fell in love with the people, the lifestyle, and everything British I took on as my own. And now I'm here in Southern California in our little Viola bubble. And so what I realized about growing up like this is that I care about these cultures and I hunger for more because everywhere I lived, I took them on as part of who I am. Their cultures were things I did in my everyday life, and I was also experienced bits of suffering in each place that I lived. And I took that on as mine as well. On top of that, the culture of my ancestors play a big role in my life in Trinidad, and it's still very active. And so another thing I realized with moving around is that I have connections and friends and family in all these places. And so I hear about the things that are happening in these places, whether or not it makes headline news. I know about when we were in England, in the summer of 2016, there's terror attacks all over Europe. And we were just there, and you'd wake up, and it's like, where's it going to be next, you know? Right now, my sister's in the British Virgin Islands, and she's working with recovery, and she's contracted to help rebuild places. And she said her first email was, I need to order some things because there's things here, and I just can't get them. And it just shows how we take things for granted. Like, we move into a house here, and it's like, I'm going to go to Target and just get light bulbs and whatever I need. And she's there with a little generator for 2 hours a day. But we don't hear about that on the news. We don't hear about how they're suffering. We don't hear about all these things. Anyway, I'm not going to go on a tangent. But I do know not everybody grows up like this, and not everybody's going to experience the things that I did in this way and ties to all the different places. And so from a biblical perspective, which is more important, and it applies to everyone, in Acts 1, we're commanded with the Great Commission to go out to all the nations. And as I was thinking about that and why that's important, it's because God would not command us to do that if the nations weren't important to him. But he does, and he does that all the way from Genesis with Adam and Eve to Revelations, where we celebrate nations in the end times. And because God values that so much, we need to value that too. Furthermore, in Isaiah 1:17, we're called to care for the orphan, the widow, and the oppressed. And again, God specifically gives us this command over and over again. So if he values that so much, we need to value that too. And so that brings me to my last point of how photojournalism is the bridge between culture and our compassion to the global news. Journalists get to share events and visually bridge us to what is happening around the rest of the world by creating this window of experience. And so I'm going to share these 2 photos. Some of you might have a hard time looking at them, so if you want, you can look away. The first one is of the drowned Syrian boy, taken by Niloufou Dermir. This photo was almost the world changer of the refugee crisis that's happening in Europe right now. So him and his family with about 19 other refugees were on a boat trying to leave the shores of Turkey, and eventually they wanted to get to Canada where their aunt was going to sponsor them. However, one story says that the waves were too rough and the smuggler jumped overboard and left them to fend for themselves, and eventually the boat capsized. Him and his brother and many other people drowned. And it wasn't until this photo got global attention that people weren't aware of how severe this was. The Prime Minister, David Cameron of the UK, he said he would take more people on from Syria because of this photo. He said it could be our child, and I think that's why this image has such a tremendous power across the world. The second photo is of the Nepal girl taken by Nick Butt. This photo was taken when these children were fleeing from the temple where they thought they were going to be safe. And this photographer was there, and he took this photo. And again, it was sort of a game changer in this whole war, as shortly after the photo was taken, the US came to a ceasefire with Vietnam. So both of these photos, they break journalistic rules of never publishing a photo of nudity and never publishing a photo of a dead body. And yet both of these photos shook the international stage on their own. And I think that's why photojournalism is so powerful in connecting us to what's happening. And so I'm going to tie this in really quickly with what I want to do. I would love to go overseas and take photos of these minority cultures that we don't ever hear about, because there's so much beauty in them, and there's so much to them that we miss in our everyday lives. I'll go back, but the first photo in this presentation and the last photo, those were taken by me in Swaziland, and it's a tiny town I probably never would have heard of if I didn't get the opportunity to go. But these children, it's an orphanage town. Some of them are found in dumpsters. Some of them have AIDS, and their parents just kind of give them up. There's just so much beauty in them, and they love, and they're just joyful. And so I just want to share these stories with people that would never, ever get to experience that. So apart from these photos being a world changer, people also start pouring money into charities to help relief. And I'm not saying we need to go overseas or we need to give all our money to these places, but I'm calling everyone to engage, value, and pray compassionately for global events. They aren't so distant when we start to think about them as on a personal level. Just take a moment, imagine these people. Imagine their hurting families. Think about how God formed each of them specifically. Think about how God knitted each of them in their mother's womb. They feel suffering, they feel hunger, they feel loss. They are human, and that's why we should care. So whether that means downloading a news app or taking part of global petitions, it's something that we need to engage with. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd like to open the floor for Q&A now.